In the northern tip of Scotland lies a place where lost souls tend to wander. Not to be saved, but simply to rest. The wind here doesn't scream like it does in the south. Instead, it whispers across stone roofs and mossy slopes, as if afraid to disturb something more sacred than life itself. Silence. Moray Firth stretched open like a deep gash between jagged cliffs and the leaden sky. The morning sea bore the color of rusted steel, cold, dull, and utterly still. No ships, no birds, not even the usual rhythm of waves. The water lay so calm, it looked like it might crack if someone tossed a single pebble into it. Nestled between hills of bracken and granite, a wooden cabin crouched quietly against the slope. Its pinewood roof had grayed with seasons of rain and salt. No curtains hung in the windows, only a mesh screen to hold back the wind. On the sill sat an old oil lamp, still bearing the faint print of a hand that used to light it each night, though no one was there to see. The man who lived there was Jude Rayner, nearly 40. A beard hugged his jaw, his hair streaked with silver, though his frame was still firm like a soldier's. Folks whispered he once worked for the army, dealing with shattered minds returning from war. Others said he failed to save any of them, not even himself. No one really knew if those stories were true. No one came to ask. Jude lived alone. No wife, no kids, no dog, no cat. Just an old rifle on the wall and a fire that kept burning even when the calendar claimed spring had come. He hadn't retreated from the world. The world had long retreated from him. Some nights, Jude lay awake. Not from nightmares, but from emptiness. No car engines, no footsteps, no strangers calling his name. The silence was so complete that if sorrow had a shape, it would sit right there across from him in that empty chair, smiling. That morning, there was no rain, but it couldn't be called sunshine either. Jude woke, as always, brewed coffee using rainwater from a wooden barrel, grabbed his fishing rod and a roll of dry bread. He stepped down a narrow trail where half-dead grass crunched underfoot. To others, it was just another day. But to Jude, any day where he could still breathe in silence was a day that mattered. At the familiar rocky shore, he set his basket down, baited the hook, and cast his line into the sea. Each motion steady, precise, like a ritual repeated for years. He sat on a smooth rock, back resting against a larger one. The coffee cooled in his metal flask, untouched. He closed his eyes. But today, the sea was silent in a strange way, not the usual morning hush, but a silence so complete it felt wrong. No distant boat horns, no wind through the chimney, not even the pulse of waves against rock, a sound that had framed his life since the day he arrived. Jude opened his eyes, lifted his head to look beyond the water. The horizon blurred into a thick band of lead, sea and sky fused in endless ash. No gradient, no contrast. Just a bleak stretch of gray without end. Then, for the first time in years, he felt cold down his spine, not from the wind, not from the chill, but because something felt off. Not loud, not obvious, but there. He laid down his rod, stood, narrowed his eyes toward the distance, where something bobbed unnaturally on the surface. A small black dot out of place in a gray painting. At first, Jude didn't think much. Maybe driftwood, a stray fishing buoy, or torn plastic bag. The sea had a habit of swallowing things and spitting them back out, unfeeling, meaningless. But something about it held his gaze. Not its size, not its shape, but the way it moved. Because it wasn't drifting, it was fighting the current. First a slight tilt against the waves, then a jerky motion, desperate like a swimmer out of strength. No rhythm, no pattern, but definitely an effort. The movement of something alive. Jude frowned. reached for the old binoculars hanging in the wooden box near the rocks, the glass fogged by sea mist, but clear enough to bring the shape into view. When the swell dipped low, he saw it. A black form, half submerged in gray water. Once, an ear rose, soaked, then fell again. A long snout breached, then vanished. And between waves he caught a glance, a wide, wild eye blinking rapidly with the current. It couldn't be mistaken. A dog, a big one, a working breed, muscular but spent, swimming, trying, failing. Jude dropped the binoculars. Something squeezed his chest. Northern wind lashed his face, but he no longer felt the cold. Just one thought pounding in his head, again and again like a drum. No way. There's no way a dog could be out there. At least 200 kilometers from shore. No ships, no wreckage, no accidents. And most of all, no one mad enough to throw a dog into the ocean. A minute passed, then 2. The creature was still there, struggling, sinking beneath its own weight. Jude's rational mind began to whisper, "You can't help. Too far, too risky, too late." But his hands had already grabbed the boat keys. His legs moved on their own. Old instincts, soldier's reflexes, things. You never really lose. Jude's boat was a tough little wooden thing, 4-stroke engine, good for up to 15 nautical miles on a decent day. He leapt aboard, cast off the rope, shoved away from the cliff. The wheel groaned. Spray hit the sides. The engine growled low like a whale, then pushed the boat forward over the rippling surface. He didn't look at the controls. Only the black speck, now fading. The sea wasn't angry, but that fake calm, that was worse. Things disappeared here without a trace. He pushed the throttle. The boat sliced through. It seemed to ask, "What are you chasing?" Jude didn't answer. No logic, no plan, just one rule. If you can still see it, you can still save it. The closer he got, the louder his heart pounded. It was the heartbeat of a man who thought he'd forgotten how to feel, revived now by a pair of desperate eyes. He saw it clearly now. Not just the head. The whole body, rising and falling. Rear legs limp, front legs barely moving, head lolling, one eye closed, mouth gasping like a fish. No time. Jude killed the engine, tossed the anchor line, threw down the rope ladder, and dove in, forgetting his phone, his knife, everything. Frigid water gripped his skin, his lungs seized. Still he swam. Each stroke a battle, each kick a prayer that he was in time. The North Sea doesn't welcome anyone. Storm or not, it always pulls downward, toward cold, nameless dark. And there, in that eerie silence, Jude Rayner swam with everything he had, cutting the water, gasping, burning, to reach a soul caught between life and death. That shape, rising, falling, was now clear. A large, dark dog, soaked, flailing with fading instinct. The chill tightened Jude's muscles. Fingers went numb. But he kept going. Kicks turned heavy. His chest burned with every breath, air so cold it felt like glass. Less than 3 meters left. Then he saw it, the front paws slowing, the body tilted, head down, eyes no longer tracking the waves, just dazed, disoriented. A moment later it sank completely, then bobbed up, not by effort, but momentum. It was letting go. Jude gritted his teeth, surged forward. When his hand finally touched the drenched fur, the dog didn't resist. No claws, no howl, no more fight. It just collapsed into his arms, like it had already surrendered to fate. His heart clenched. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a pull, bringing back a spirit that had already given up, praying it hadn't drifted too far. He wrapped his arms around its belly, lifted its drooping head to his shoulder. Wet fur clung to his skin. A faint breath curled like smoke into the air. Jude whispered, not sure if it was a plea or a spell, "Stay with me, please." No reply, but still breathing, That was enough. He turned toward the boat. Left hand cradled the dog's head, right hand stroked water behind, legs kicked low and tight, conserving what little strength remained. The water felt thicker now, every meter a struggle. The dog's weight dragged him down, forced him to shift and rebalance, so they wouldn't sink together. He didn't know how long it took. 4 minutes? 10? Time had no meaning. Only when the boat's side rose before him did he feel his hands begin to shake. The rope ladder still hung. He reached. One hand gripped wood, the other held the dog. Muscles screamed. Still he didn't let go. With a final push, he hoisted the dog aboard. First the paws scraped the deck. Then the back half, dead weight, dragged up. The dog collapsed, unmoving, shivering. Jude clambered after, collapsed beside it. Breathing hard, eyes fixed on the creature, as if even one blink might let it slip away. Its fur was soaked, caked in salt, dirt, and blood. Thick coat matted, revealing scrapes and sores. Between its shoulders, a scar had split open from the cold. Not a fresh wound, but old. Jude pressed his hand to its chest. A faint beat. But it was there. He grabbed the thermal blanket, wrapped it around them both. The wind smelled of fish, wood, and blood. But to Jude, it smelled like hope. He didn't ask its name, didn't ask, "Where did you come from?" or "What happened?" Those questions didn't matter now, only one did. "Are you still alive?" And the fragile beat under his palm answered. Jude sat beside it, arms around the trembling body. The boat rocked gently. Above, the sky began to fade from gray. A soft whimper rose, a broken breath. The dog's eyes cracked open, unfocused, but no longer empty. "It's okay," Jude whispered. "No one's going to hurt you now, I promise." He placed a hand on its head, gently stroked. A gesture not easily given to a stranger. But the dog didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Just lay there, as if it could finally stop fighting and start breathing. For a moment, Jude felt something strange. Something familiar. A feeling from long ago, when he once cradled a wounded soldier off a chopper, blood streaming, clutching Jude's hand, whispering, "I don't want to die." Today, there were no words, but the eyes that met his in silence? They said the same thing. Jude brought the dog back to the cabin just as the sky was beginning to fade. The western horizon softened like a wound closing slowly. The last glow of the day slipped behind the cliffs, casting the entire valley into a bluish-gray hush, cold and silent, like the air before the season's first snowfall. He wrapped Echo in an old thermal jacket and gently laid him down on the thick wool rug in front of the fireplace. The fire had already been lit. Golden-orange light flickered across Echo's damp coat, drying it by the minute. Each glimmer like the flame was trying to awaken something that had been asleep for far too long. The cabin was small and sparse, not a single decoration in excess. Everything inside was clean, tidy, almost to a fault. So precise it felt sterile. And for the first time in years, something else breathed within its walls. Not human, no. But the presence of Echo shifted the space in a strange way, as if the room had been holding its breath all this time and only now had been given permission to exhale. Echo didn't react. He breathed heavily and wearily, but made no sound. No whimper, no growl, not even a twitch. Jude fetched a small bowl, filled it with warm water from the kettle, and brought it near his muzzle. The dog didn't lift his head, but when the water brushed his lips, his tongue stirred, a few soft laps. Not greedy, not desperate, just enough not to die of thirst. Food was a different story. Jude placed a bit of boiled chicken in front of him, a treat that any stray would have devoured on sight. But Echo didn't touch it. Eyes half shut, body faintly trembling, legs drawn up in a familiar defensive curl, the posture of a creature unsure whether this place was safe or just another trap in disguise. Jude didn't push. He sat on the chair across from him, said nothing, just watched. He'd done the same in the army, sitting silently for hours next to a soldier who wouldn't speak, just to let them know someone was there when they were ready to come back. It had been years since anyone else existed in this house, and now here was a being, soaked, nameless, voiceless, washed ashore. There was something unusual. Echo didn't avoid Jude's gaze, nor did he try to approach or act friendly. He didn't behave like a dog that had been abandoned. Most strays either cowered from fear or clung desperately to any kindness offered. But Echo was different. He was simply present, calm, guarded. He didn't need anyone, but he didn't completely reject them either. Jude tried a few names: Max, Rex, Hunter, Shadow. Not a flick of an ear, not a blink, not even a muscle twitch, like none of them belonged to him, or like the language of humans had been stripped from him long ago. When night fell, Jude adjusted the rug, giving Echo more space. He wasn't used to sharing the cabin, but he wasn't unsettled by it either. What unsettled him more was the moment he stood to go to bed, and felt a pang of guilt for leaving Echo alone by the fire. Not because Echo needed him, but maybe, just maybe, because Jude needed Echo more than he realized. Before entering his room, Jude turned back. One last glance. Echo still lay there, breathing slow, eyes shut, unmoving. But the way he breathed, like he was holding on to life one breath at a time, told Jude something unspoken. Some creatures, once they've hovered too close to the edge of existence, can never sleep normally again. That night, the fire burned nearly all the way through, not because of the cold, but because something was coming back to life, in silence. The next morning, Jude knew instantly. The cabin was no longer his alone. The soft scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint musk of wet fur, and a different warmth filled the space. Not from the fire, but from the quiet presence of a soul that had nearly been lost. Echo was awake, but he didn't stir, didn't lick his paws, didn't whine for food or water. He simply lay there, head raised slightly, eyes open watching the light of dawn creep across the wooden floorboards. Jude moved quietly. Military instinct had taught him how not to startle a watchful creature. Echo glanced at him once, brief, unafraid, then looked away. No growl, no flinch, no approach either. Instead of coaxing, Jude sat down a short distance away. He opened a small tin of dry bread and pulled out a few slices of cured meat. He placed them a few feet from Echo, then backed off. Echo observed. He didn't rush. He sniffed, not like a hungry stray, but as if analyzing the scent, assessing. Then he stepped forward, slowly, ate each piece one at a time. No tearing, no crumbs, each bite deliberate, measured, precise. Jude studied him. The more he watched, the more convinced he became. This wasn't a stray. Echo didn't act on instinct. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch at shadows. He didn't beg, didn't wag, didn't seek approval. He was composed. When finished, Echo didn't search for more. He simply returned to his spot, lay down, eyes back to the window, ears perked like radar, listening to something far beyond human hearing. Jude exhaled, then muttered quietly to himself, "You're more soldier than stray." The words lingered in the cabin like a verdict that had already been passed. And in that moment, Jude remembered those eyes, at trauma recovery centers. The soldiers who couldn't sleep, the warriors who never came fully home. The way Echo moved, ate, responded, it all bore the hallmarks of training. Not basic training, not obedience school, but something deeper, longer, relentless, Only one kind of being got training like that, tactical K9. A few minutes later, Echo rose and walked a slow circle around the cabin. He limped slightly on his left leg, maybe from the long hours in water or an old injury. But every step was unnervingly silent. His claws made no sound on the wooden floor. He didn't bump into chairs, didn't nudge objects. It was like he'd learned how to exist without leaving a trace. Jude noted every motion. He didn't write anything down, but it was all etched in memory, as clean as a field report. Echo stopped at the window, stared out. A breeze moved the curtain. He didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, blinked once, and sat, posture rigid, alert. That wasn't how strays sat. Jude knew, because he'd taught that exact stance. To dogs assigned to perimeter guard, intrusion detection, hostage rescue. If Echo had learned that, the question wasn't where he came from. It was why he ended up in the middle of the sea. And more importantly, who had put him there? On the third day, the air turned colder and damper than usual. Jude was stoking the fire. The glow was dimming, red embers threading under gray ash. Outside, the wind whispered through dry pines near the cabin. Echo lay near the door, eyes half closed, ears relaxed. A rare moment of peace filled the space, until that sound tore it open. Rotors, not close, not clear, but unmistakable. A sound any former soldier could recognize in under a second. Jude looked up, and Echo almost instantly sprang to alert. No bark, no howl, no turning to the noise like any ordinary dog would. Instead, he sank low, pressed flat to the floorboards like a shadow melting into the light. Eyes wide, taut, ears tucked, tail pulled close, breathing slowed to near invisible, not panic. Perfect concealment. Jude froze. He'd seen that before. Years ago at a military training base near a conflict zone, a dog named Rook, Special Ops Unit, had done the exact same thing at the sound of a low-flying chopper. The trainer had said, "He's not scared." He remembers. And he remembers with his flesh. Echo, now, wasn't reacting. He was remembering. Some part of his brain, buried deep, was being triggered. Where sound meant threat, meant duty, meant loss. This wasn't instinct. This was programming. The chopper faded. The rotors dulled to a hum, then vanished into wind. But Echo didn't move. It took nearly 5 minutes before his body relaxed, his head rose, and his eyes shifted toward Jude. There was no fear in them. Only memory. Jude sat down on the floor. Not too close, just enough to show he was still there. "I know you heard it," he said softly. "And I'm guessing you were once very close to that sound, on a day with no way home." Echo didn't reply, but he shifted, sat upright. Tail still low, but his neck was high again. Jude saw something else, something small but unmissable. Echo blinked in a pattern. 1 dash short. 2 longer. That was a hand signal response blink. "You don't just remember," Jude whispered. "You're still waiting for the next command." The air in the cabin changed. This was no longer a home. It was a holding station, a moment suspended, a former weapon, awaiting instructions. And Jude, more than anyone, knew that feeling. Because he'd once been a tool, too. But this time, he wouldn't let Echo remain one. The fourth day brought a light drizzle. A thick fog wrapped around the cabin, blurring the pines behind it like they had vanished into a veil of silver smoke. Echo had started moving around the house, not fast, not strong, but every step was controlled, like each motion had been calculated and executed with purpose. Jude decided that day he'd bathe him, not just to clean him, but to look closer, beneath what the eye alone could catch. He prepared a basin of warm water, added a few drops of eucalyptus oil and dried rosemary, remedies he used to calm his nerves on sleepless nights. When he called, Echo came forward. No tail wag, no hesitation. As if he understood this was necessary, as if his body remembered the care routines of high-pressure environments. Jude gently poured water over Echo's back. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. He just stood there, 4 paws firmly planted, head lowered slightly, like a soldier being checked after returning from the field. As Jude's hand ran down the back of his neck, his fingers brushed something odd, a small cold spot buried beneath the thick coat. He froze. Parted the fur. Under the dim light, tangled with brine and matted hair, lay a tiny strip of metal, about the length of a fingertip, thin like a rusted razor blade, the edges corroded by salt. It wasn't bone, wasn't a scab. It lay just beneath the skin, too deep to see, but shallow enough that once touched, it could not be missed. He reached for a pair of tweezers. Echo didn't move. He only turned his head slightly, eyes on Jude, calm but sharp. It wasn't the look of a creature in pain. It was the gaze of someone who knew exactly what was being removed. When the object came free, Jude laid it on the wooden table, wiped it with a dry cloth. Beneath the rust and salt, an engraving appeared, faint but still legible. E3. Just 2 characters. No QR code, no unit number, no manufacturer's mark. Nothing traceable, except that 1 letter, 1 number. Jude stared at the metal piece for a long time. It wasn't a name tag, not a microchip, and definitely not civilian tech. This thing had a purpose. It had been marked, embedded, and then erased from history. He turned to Echo. The dog was now sitting by the door, eyes fixed on him. No longer dull, no longer blank, but awake, focused, like a being who once was turned into a tool and was now standing at the edge of something new. Jude slipped the metal piece into his pocket. "You carry the answer," he said quietly, "even if they never let you know what it meant." On Thursday morning, as Jude turned on the coffee machine, he felt something had shifted. Not Echo. The dog was still lying quietly on the corner of the rug, eyes tracking his every movement. It was Jude himself who had changed. The dog's presence, its calm but deliberate reactions, the way it surveyed its surroundings. Each detail pulled old instincts from the back of Jude's mind. He had lived alone for too long. Mornings in the cabin had always been silent, predictable, without disruption. But with Echo, that rhythm had been quietly interrupted. Not by noise, not by chaos, but by something persistent and invisible. Like groundwater slowly carving through stone. Echo didn't need to speak, didn't need to do much at all. His presence alone was a question with no easy answer. A question that forced Jude to confront memories he had long buried behind invisible doors. Every subtle reaction from the dog was a puzzle piece of something Jude recognized. Something familiar, but terrifying. Something he knew he couldn't decode alone. He picked up his phone. It had been ages since he called anyone besides the delivery driver. His finger hovered, slow, almost afraid that a single wrong digit might awaken a past he could no longer control. Eventually, he stopped on a name. Morgan Keats. Morgan was a part of Jude's past, not because they were close, but because they had once stood at opposite ends of the same battlefield. Jude patched up what was broken. Morgan trained what would break, or be broken. A legendary canine handler, renowned for his ability to read a dog's mind, but equally feared for his cold precision. After retiring from the military, Morgan had chosen isolation, running a small farm high in the Montana wilderness, where he continued to train dogs, but now for rescue, search missions, and the restoration of trust. The call connected after 2 rings. "It's been a while, Raynor," Morgan's voice came through, unchanged, steady, like gravel dragged across steel, seasoned and cautious. "I've got a dog," Jude replied bluntly. A long silence followed. "You make it sound like you found a Cold War protocol chip." Jude pressed his lips together. He didn't smile. "I found him offshore, over 200 kilometers from the coast. No boat, no buoy, just him, alone." No breath from the other end. Only silence, the kind that meant someone was processing every word with military precision. "No chip, no collar. But the responses, they don't lie. He's trained. Reflexes too sharp. This isn't some family guard dog." Morgan paused, then asked, "Did you check him physically? Back, neck, scapula?" "I found a metal shard beneath the fur on his neck, thin, corroded by salt, hand-etched, just 2 characters, E3. Another pause. "Is he afraid of helicopters?" Jude looked up. His expression darkened. "Not afraid? He hides. Ears down, body low, breath held, like he's waiting for a signal." Morgan was silent for a few more seconds. Then his voice dropped. "I'm coming. Not for you. For the dog." Jude was grateful. Not for the help, but because men like Morgan only moved when something felt deeply wrong in the system. And when Morgan said wrong, he didn't mean on a personal level. He meant system failure. And that made Jude's heart go cold. Morgan arrived the next morning. An old pickup truck, caked in mountain dust, rolled to a stop in front of the cabin without honking. Jude heard the tires crunch on gravel, steady, measured, like a soldier moving through the woods, closing in without a sound. He stepped out wearing a dark khaki jacket, the brim of his cap hiding half his face. Tall frame, broad shoulders, eyes set deep like the hollow of a cliff. When he walked into the cabin, Echo was still lying near the window, head turned toward the light. Morgan didn't speak. He set his gloves on the table and stood for a moment, observing, then walked straight into the room. No greeting, no questions. His eyes locked on the dog. Echo looked up. No growl, no bark. But something shifted in his gaze, from indifferent to focused. His ears moved, perked, then dipped slightly, as if he had seen this man before, or had once been trained by someone just like him. Morgan sat down, not too close. He placed his hands on his knees, palms open and relaxed, not threatening, not inviting. Just present. "Hello, boy," he said, voice low and grounded. "I'm not here to give you orders. I just want to know, if you remember." Echo didn't move, but his body tensed ever so slightly. Morgan didn't rush. He slowly rotated his right hand, then raised it. 2 fingers joined, palm facing down, drawing a low arc through the air. A tactical hand signal. In an instant, Echo dropped to the floor. No hesitation, no confusion. A perfect, clean response, like he'd just been trained that morning. Morgan didn't blink. He moved to the next signal, hand to forehead, then down to the ground. Echo crawled forward, settled at the side of the chair. No sound, no misstep. Jude stood in the doorway, speechless. "I think you already know," Morgan said softly. "This isn't a civilian dog, not law enforcement either. He's tactical grade, and he still remembers the commands." Echo lay still, eyes trained on Morgan, waiting. But this time, Morgan simply nodded and returned his hands to his knees. "That's enough." Echo didn't move again, but his eyes were different now, no longer lost. They had been seen, understood. He knew this man spoke his language, the one they had once forced him to learn. Morgan turned to Jude. This dog was part of a special operations unit. That level of response only comes from units that rely on silent signaling. He was trained for conflict zones, where even a whisper could get the whole team killed. Jude's hands clenched. Any way to trace his unit? Morgan shook his head. Not from behavior, but if you're right about the metal tag, it could be an internal designation code. Markers like E3 usually refer to Tier 3 bioassets, battle-tested, but not independently operational. Likely recon support, not primary. So who leaves a dog like that in the middle of the sea? Jude asked. Morgan didn't answer right away. He looked into Echo's eyes. Some dogs don't go missing. They get decommissioned. Jude felt that like a blade across the ribs. Something colder than ocean water rose in his chest. Echo stayed still. But Jude knew. Something deep within him had started to wake. No one spoke for the next few minutes. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already passed between them. In the way Echo lay quiet without being told. In the way Morgan slowly removed his gloves like a ritual before a being that had once been a weapon. Jude leaned against the doorframe, his grip tightening on the edge of the table. Inside him was a slow-burning anger, not a fire, but a quiet erosion. Like salt water eating through steel. He had worked with forgotten soldiers. He'd read the classified reports, those internal cleanups, where creatures like Echo were reclassified after each mission, as if their souls could be reset like hard drives. Morgan broke the silence. His voice was steady, sharp, like a round chambered in a rifle. Did you notice how he walks? Left leg's a little off. Not the bone, though. It's mechanical trauma, healed, the kind you see in dogs that have done long load drills across rough terrain. Jude nodded. My guess, mountain recon. Maybe alpine assault support. Could be, Morgan replied. But what's more important is this. He doesn't react to household stimuli. Not the smell of the stove, the coffee machine, the radio. But he does respond to low-frequency engines, spinning blades, creaky wood doors, like bunker hatches. And that hand signal reflex? That's not basic. That's Tier 2 tactics, only taught inside high-clearance units. He stepped closer to Echo and sat on the floor. No barrier, no pretense, just the presence of someone who had spent enough time among creatures known only by their code. We used to call them K9T3, Morgan said quietly. Tactical K9s, Tier 3, deployed in high-risk missions, not returned when the unit disbands, considered field software, not soldiers. Jude's hands whitened at the knuckles. Goddamn! Morgan looked at him. No judgment in his eyes. It's not your fault. Not his either. This is by design. A system built not to save what thinks, but to reuse what obeys. Echo was still, but his head had lifted slightly. His eyes scanned, not panicked, but as if he were listening. Jude moved forward and sat beside him. He placed a hand on Echo's back. Light, like touching a mirror that had once shattered. I don't care what code you used to be, he whispered. From now on, you're just you. Echo didn't turn, but his tail twitched once. Not wagging, not thumping, just a small motion, enough to make Jude's chest ache. Morgan stood. He went to the table, pulled a worn notebook from his coat pocket. Inside was a list of unit codes, symbols, and training protocols, the kind only someone who had helped design the system would have. I'll help you trace the E3 mark. But if I'm right, we're not just sheltering a dog. We're holding living data, a missing piece someone out there wants to disappear. Jude didn't ask who. He already knew. Creatures like Echo were never accidents. They were signatures, stamped and signed into existence, the result of decisions written in cold, bureaucratic language. And now, in this mountain cabin, a dog once labeled as an asset was raising his head, not to a command, but to the pull of something more instinctive. Morgan remained by the table, flipping through the worn notebook. Handwritten notes tangled with cryptic codes and layered markings filled the pages like maps of a war never named. Jude stood by the window, eyes on the trees but ears on every word. The room was bathed in a pale gold light of late afternoon. Still, but no longer hollow. Echo rose from the rug. Not a sound, not a stir of dust. He stood there, between two men, as if a fragment of memory had stepped out of an old dream. He didn't look directly at either of them, but his gaze, subtle, steady, spoke volumes. There was light in his eyes, a reflection from the very bottom of a soul once trained to obey, to follow, to disappear. And now, to remember. He knew they were speaking about him. He knew every word carried a shard of the truth he had lived. And he stood there not to seek recognition, but to affirm something far more important. He was still himself, even after they had tried to make him something else. Morgan looked at him for a long time. He didn't give a command, didn't test a reflex. He simply closed the notebook, set it gently on the table, and turned toward Jude. "You see it, don't you?" he said softly, almost a whisper. "He doesn't need a name to be who he is. He used to be a code. But now he's not waiting for permission." Jude stepped slowly toward Echo. The firelight stretched his shadow across the wooden wall, merging with Echo's. Long, quiet, the outline of a warrior no longer in uniform. He knelt beside him and laid a hand against his neck. The dog's skin was warm, his fur softer now after several medicated baths. But what held Jude's gaze, what made it impossible to look away, were Echo's eyes. They held something no ordinary dog had ever shown. "You're hearing all of this, aren't you?" Jude asked quietly. Echo didn't move, but he leaned forward, and his nose touched Jude's knee, a gesture not taught, not commanded. A small voluntary act from a being beginning to believe it could connect again. Morgan pulled a cloth from his coat pocket, wiped his hands, then brought out a black leather collar, the kind used for combat dogs. No name, just a tactical latch. "You planning to keep him?" he asked. Jude didn't answer right away. He sat there, hand still resting on Echo's neck, eyes fixed on the fading glow of the firelight, flickering against the old walls and the ghosts they held. "No," he said finally. "I'm not keeping him. I'm walking with him." And Echo, as if he understood, lowered his head, gently resting it on Jude's foot. No one had trained him to do that. No signal had instructed that behavior. It came from something deeper. Will, trust, and a primal part of survival that knew, sometimes, all it takes to bring a shattered soul back is a gaze that never demands anything. In that quiet wooden cabin, between two men who had once known loss, and one creature once considered disposable, something unspoken had been forged. No signal, no command, no name needed, only a single enduring truth. Echo was still here. And this time, he wasn't standing alone. Night fell faster after the rain. The moonlight, hidden behind thick gray clouds, left the entire hillside wrapped in a heavy darkness, silent and oppressive. Inside the cabin, Jude sat alone in the small back room. It was a space he rarely used, reserved for scribbling notes on old drafts or tinkering with tools. But tonight, it became the one place where he had to face something he never thought he would, logging back into the old military system. Echo was asleep, curled beneath the fireplace, barely stirring. Morgan had left after dinner. He promised to return with a contact from the old network who might help trace the E3 designation. But Jude couldn't wait. Not out of impatience, but because something was pulling at him. Something buried that demanded to be unearthed now, while Echo was still here. While those eyes still burned clearly in his mind. He retrieved an old laptop from the cupboard. The brown leather cover was cracked, the keyboard worn smooth. It booted slowly, with a familiar hum, then flickered to life. He connected to a long, retired, secure network, one once granted to civilian consultants working on joint projects between the military and trauma rehabilitation centers. He wasn't even sure it still worked. But Jude had kept the manual override codes. Almost no one outside the system knew them. The login screen appeared. He entered the access key. 3 failed attempts would lock the system for 24 hours. Jude exhaled, then typed. Once, twice. Silence. On the 3rd try, the system accepted. A flood of files appeared. Old folders, cryptic names, codes. He navigated through them like someone who had once lived there, though now a guest. He headed to the Biological Asset Archives. In the military, dogs were never filed like pets. They were assets, and every asset had a code. He typed in K9-T3, then Echo, then E3. No clear results. Then he remembered. The older software used the original biosystem structure. He switched to deeper access, using an override code. A code he once believed he'd never need again. The screen glitched, then shifted to black with white text. A single blinking line appeared, as if asking one last time, "Are you sure you want to access restricted content?" Jude pressed YES. A list of data blocks emerged. No names, no readable files, but one code caught his attention, ODN-R7-E3. He clicked it open. The first line read, Odin Protocol, classified beneath it, asset class, K9 Tier 3 Experimental Deployment Handler Clearance, required Neural Reflex Sync Program Trial. Jude read each line, heart tightening. This wasn't ordinary training. This was experimental, neural reflex synchronization. It meant the dog's reactions weren't purely conditioned. They were semi-autonomous, shaped by neural stimuli, combat reflexes triggered through controlled pulses to the nervous system. A method designed in theory for sensor-driven machines. And Echo, or E3, had been part of it. Jude scrolled down. A line stood out. Last registered activity, offshore recon, unspecified location. Timestamp. 3 days before Jude pulled Echo from the sea. Below that, status, terminated/lost. No retrieval issued, no rescue alert, no tracking, just a single command. Data wipe, do not recover. Jude sat motionless in the dark, the screen no longer in front of him. Only Echo, in the ocean, eyes wide open, desperate but refusing to give in. Now he understood, because Echo had once been controlled. But somehow, he broke free and lived. And now, the most terrifying part wasn't Odin itself. It was that no one in the system had bothered to ask if Echo was still alive. Because maybe they didn't want him to be. Jude pulled the chair closer to the screen. The pale blue light from the secure interface reflected off his cheekbones, sharpening the lines of a face already drawn and heavy with thought. The words, Odin Protocol, classified, continued to pulse in the top corner, like a slow, hypnotic warning to anyone who dared to look deeper. He skimmed the initial brief, a dense web of military jargon and technical language, but Jude understood. He had read hundreds of these reports during his time as a consultant. And now it was clear. Odin wasn't just about controlling dogs in combat. It was a neurological behavior manipulation experiment, a level of control never meant to be disclosed. Another segment appeared on the screen. Odin Protocol is an experimental canine neural response alignment program initiated under Black Budget Tier 3 funding. Its core objective is to develop seamless neuroreflex synchronization between canine assets and mission command parameters via a remote stimulation interface. The program bypasses standard behavioral training by embedding learned commands through targeted neural modulation. Jude held his breath. It meant Echo hadn't been trained through discipline, but through neural interference. Not conditioning, but direct manipulation of his nervous system. Reflexes forced by electric pulses, like a remote control, except with a living soul on the receiving end. A diagram of Echo's neural map appeared, nodes for chip placement, areas labeled sensory override. A note read, "Auditory input neutralized," meaning Echo had once been stripped of normal sound response. He only reacted to activation tones. Then a secondary log appeared. Subject E3 demonstrates exceptionally high neural retention rates. Voluntary disobedience not detected within Phase 1 to 3. Phase 4 initiated prematurely due to unexpected offshore variable. Status: terminated. Asset lost. Voluntary disobedience not detected. Jude repeated the words silently. They never believed Echo could think for himself. When he vanished offshore, they didn't believe he had escaped. They believed he had failed. Jude's hand tightened on the armrest. His temple throbbed. A creature, with those eyes, that precision, had once been classified as having no will. He scrolled to the end of the file. The last line was an execution log. Execute wipe. E3 ID. Result: success. They didn't search for Echo. They erased him. Jude's eyes burned. He couldn't remember the last time anger rose this slow and hot in him, like magma, not flame. A quiet devastation that melted the last scrap of trust he had left for the system he once served. Echo wasn't lost. He was a living piece of evidence, of something they buried. And if anyone out there found out he survived, they wouldn't let it go. Jude saved the file to a separate hard drive, severed the network connection, and shut the laptop. He walked back to the fireplace, where Echo still slept. But now each breath from the dog rang louder in his mind. Not because of sound, but because every inhale was proof that a rejected soul had refused to disappear, and now was starting to return. Jude sat in stillness before the fire for a long time. The only light left came from the dim red embers, cracking softly beneath the logs. The pop of dry wood echoed like teeth chattering in a frozen room. But the cold inside Jude wasn't from the air. It came from a single data line, a sentence as flat as it was final. Status: terminated. Asset lost. They didn't call him a dog, not a partner, not a being. They called him an asset. And like any malfunctioning piece of equipment, he had been shut down. Jude knew the language of that system. He had once helped write its reports, had once argued that unresponsive sounded more humane than broken. But now, reading those very reports, while a living soul breathed behind him, he realized just how complicit he had once been in that cold logic. He reopened the system's hidden logs, records usually locked from standard access. Beneath Phase 4, Offshore Anomaly, were fragmented lines. Asset E3 disengaged from embedded command loop. Failure to respond to handler override. Suspected protocol corruption. No recovery dispatched. Termination assumed. Operation scrubbed. No one searched for Echo. No retrieval team. No distress signal. Just a quiet kill order. One final note at the bottom read, "Subject displays signs of reflexive memory imprinting. Deviated from override at critical junction. Recommendation: classify as unstable. Unfit for reintegration." Jude stared at the word unstable. He remembered Echo's eyes during the helicopter incident, not wild, but lucid inside fear. It was a struggle between what had been programmed into him and something that had never been named. And suddenly, Jude saw the truth. Echo wasn't Odin's failure. He was the one thing the system couldn't control. A being once ruled by reflex, who had begun to choose for himself. That's why they cut him loose. Jude switched on a small desk lamp and pulled out a thin folder from the bottom drawer, a place where he kept unfiled documents, the kind that were never meant to make it into official reports. It was a habit left over from his time in the field. A record of what should not exist on paper. Inside, there was a single page, marked with a strange code that had been circulated internally 4 years ago. The signature had been scrubbed, but the access string was still valid. ODN-PH 4-RECALL-LOCK. He typed the code back into the system, opened the internal interface once more. A file appeared. Phase 4. Unsanctioned Activity Log. The file detailed minute-by-minute data from failed command recalls. Only 3 entries existed. One of them belonged to E3. Jude leaned in. Timecode 031217Z. Command issued, return. Response, delay 1.4 seconds. Deviation, route deviation of 27 degrees. Override failed. Manual control disengaged. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't malfunctioned. He had hesitated. A delay of less than 2 seconds. But in that delay, a voice in the dark had spoken. I don't want to. He hadn't just survived. He had resisted. And now, Jude, the man who once interpreted the psyches of soldiers conditioned into reflex, was facing the first being who had shattered both reflex and command. Echo wasn't a broken asset. He was a refusal no one wanted to admit. And when Jude closed the laptop, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. If the world once saw Echo as a threat, then from now on, Jude would stand between it and him. The next morning, Jude woke to a strange kind of silence. Not the familiar mountain stillness, the ambient hush of wind and rustling pine, but a deeper, more unsettling quiet. The kind that tightened the throat, made you pause in the hallway and turn instinctively toward the window. He threw on a light jacket and stepped out of the bedroom. Echo wasn't lying where he'd been. The rug by the fireplace was still warm, but empty. Jude turned to the large window overlooking the forest. And there he saw him. Echo stood in absolute stillness, upright, ears up, eyes fixed. He made no sound, no movement, just stared into the dim tree line beyond the cabin. Jude walked toward him, careful not to make a noise. Early light sliced through the fogged glass, casting a pale reflection of Echo's eyes against the window pane. But the dog wasn't watching birds or deer. He was locked on something. A precise, unmoving point buried in the shadowed wood. Jude pressed his palm against the wooden frame. Echo didn't flinch. One front paw lifted slightly, not in fear but in alert posture. A trained wait. Jude had seen it before, in soldiers on the edge of ambush zones. A reflex posture, waiting for confirmation. Nothing outside moved. But Jude felt it. A faint shiver ran down his spine. Not from the cold, but from something older. Something in his gut that hadn't stirred in years. His instincts. And they were ringing. He stepped back, pulled a pair of binoculars from the bookshelf, raised them to his eyes, scanned the clearing, the slopes, the lower ridges of the trees. Then he saw it. A flicker of reflected light. Too steady to be chance. Metallic. Small. The glint of something moving behind the canopy. Not an animal. Not an accident. Someone was watching the cabin. Jude said nothing. He lowered the binoculars, moved beside Echo, crouched slightly, placed a hand on the dog's neck. Echo didn't turn, but his muscles drew tight, like a bowstring about to release. "You feel it too," Jude whispered. "Good. Because I think we're about to have company." He stood, locked the door, opened the wooden safe, pulled out his sidearm, checked the magazine. Not because he wanted a fight, but because anyone watching a remote cabin at dawn usually didn't come to talk. Echo stayed by the window, a silent sentinel, his gaze unwavering, breathing steady, posture flawless. And in that moment, Jude understood. He didn't need sensors, didn't need alarms. He only needed a soul that had once survived a system, and that alone was enough to sense when a storm was coming. 3:00 in the afternoon. The wind shifted. Jude stepped outside, flashlight and signal detection kit in hand. The air had changed, not just because of the low-pressure system pushing down from the western highlands, but because of a silence that no longer felt natural. Birds, usually frantic before a storm, had gone still. Not a chirp. Echo hadn't left the cabin. He sat by the door, eyes fixed on the distant forest, as if something out there hadn't yet disappeared. Jude went back inside and activated the signal scanner. The old device, a holdover from his days analyzing covert operations, usually emitted a soft beep, interference from a Highland broadcast tower. But today, as he passed it near the window frame, it let out a sharp whine. The light blinked red. A signal. Jude's brow furrowed. He scanned the doorframe, the table edge, beneath the cupboards, until his hand found something under the wooden bench by the entrance. A small click. He pried open the panel and found a tiny metal device, no bigger than a fingertip, secured with insulating glue. The signal light blinked every 10 seconds. A tracker. Someone had placed it in the cabin. Maybe before Jude found Echo. Maybe more recently. No logo. No serial number. No registration. This was the kind used only in internal surveillance programs. Jude removed the device, wrapped it in foil, and sealed it inside a tin box beneath the hearth. Echo walked over, not growling, not barking, but his eyes darkened. He knew. Just as dusk began to fall, a black SUV appeared. No headlights, no noise. It glided silently along the narrow dirt road, parking just at the forest's edge. Far enough not to be noticed at a glance. Close enough for a direct line of sight to the cabin. A man stepped out. Black jacket, hood up, dark sunglasses. No backpack, no phone. He simply stood there, watching, as if waiting for a reaction. Echo pressed close to Jude's leg. His body was stone, no sign of fear. His eyes locked on the stranger. Unblinking. Jude gripped his sidearm, but he didn't raise it. The man didn't move, didn't approach, just lifted a hand and placed something on the hood of the SUV. A small device. A soft green light blinked. Jude knew what it was. Not a camera, not a bug, a command transmitter. Echo stepped back, head tilted, ears dropped. His gaze dulled, like he had heard something no human could detect. "Damn it," Jude whispered. "They're not here to ask questions. They're here for retrieval." He stepped in front of Echo, placing himself between the dog and the signal. The first gust of evening wind swept in, carrying the scent of wet leaves and something nameless. A silent warning. And in that space, between man and dog, a choice had to be made. Jude didn't wait for the man to act. He recognized this kind of approach too well. Silent, passive, projecting presence through technology and posture. No weapons, just pressure, meant to make you back down without being touched. It was how specialized recovery units operated, And Echo, without question, was one of those things never meant to resurface. "Go," Jude said quietly. Not a command. Just a word. Echo understood. He moved away from the door, headed for the back of the cabin where the side exit opened onto a trail into the woods. Jude stuffed the USB drive holding the ODIN program into an inner pocket, along with the sealed hard drive. Grabbed spare magazines, a folding knife, a compact flashlight, and one emergency water bottle. He opened the cabinet under the stairs and pulled out a pack he had prepared long ago. Inside, encrypted documents, a mini satellite unit, a map of the northern range, and a signal jammer. "We're pulling out, Echo." They exited through the rear. Echo led, silent, sure-footed, as if trained to guide through dense terrain. Jude followed close, pausing now and then to listen. Overhead, the clouds hung low. Darkness dropped faster than usual, and that SUV, Jude knew, it could be broadcasting. They pushed deeper into the forest, through twisted roots and sloped earth. Jude chose uneven ground, harder to track. Echo stayed close, always glancing back, ears alert, his posture sharp, as if executing a tactical retreat. When they reached the boundary of the old research station, a relic from the Cold War era once used by patrol teams, Jude stopped. He pulled aside a moss-covered board, revealing a shallow bunker. The door still worked. Inside was damp, dark, and thick with the scent of rust and soil. But it was shelter, enough to hold through the night. Jude and Echo crawled in. He bolted the door. Before shutting off the flashlight, he turned to look. Echo was standing, head slightly bowed, but his eyes glowed in the dark. "They know you're alive," Jude whispered. "And I don't think they mean to let you stay that way." Echo didn't answer, but his gaze, steady, unafraid, was all the confirmation Jude needed. He knew, and he had already chosen, not to go back. Midnight. Outside, the wind swept through the canopy, making strange, broken whispers in the leaves. Jude remained awake. Sitting with his back against the bunker wall, gun resting on his knee, watching the beam of the flashlight dim with each slow breath. Echo lay not far from him, curled between two dry blankets. At first he slept soundly, but as the wind shifted, as the silence grew too deep, he began to tremble. Not from cold. Jude saw it, his shoulders, belly, and hind legs twitching in small pulses. Shallow breaths, eyes closed but ears flicking as if catching a sound that didn't belong here. Then it began. A faint screech, too soft for human hearing, but the signal scanner in Jude's bag flashed. He yanked it out. The screen showed 16.4 hertz, a low-frequency control pulse. Echo twitched harder. Muscles tensed unnaturally. His head jerked, upper lip pulled back, exposing teeth, not in a growl, but in resistance. Jude rushed over, dropped to his knees. He pressed a hand to Echo's chest, gently applied pressure, then called out, "Echo, look at me!" Echo's eyes snapped open, clouded, empty. He didn't see Jude, but the look, full of pain, confusion, torn by a command he never chose, made Jude want to scream. Another screech. Echo flinched, backed against the wall, panting, rear legs trembling violently, his face twisted, trapped between survival instinct and a memory not his own. "No, no one gets to force you again," Jude hissed, trying to drown out the hum. He raised the signal disruptor, activated the counter pulse. The scanner blinked, neutralized. Echo blinked. Once, then again. His eyes cleared. He exhaled, long, ragged, and collapsed. No more seizures, but Jude could hear his heart thudding wildly. "You just experienced a recall command," Jude whispered. They're testing to see if you still belong to them. Echo didn't bark, didn't react, but he stepped forward, rested his head on Jude's thigh. An apology with no words, like a child ashamed of a reflex it didn't choose. Jude stroked his back gently. It's okay. You stayed. This time it was your choice. And in that cold, forgotten bunker, once a depot for weapons and nothing else, a living soul had just rejected its first leash. Not through strength, through will. Morning came, but the sky still hung heavy with gray, as if night had not fully left the treetops. A cold draft slipped through the cracks of the shelter, thickening the air with damp quiet. Jude woke from a restless sleep, the ache in his left shoulder a reminder of the hard floor he'd barely managed to doze on. Echo was still there, no longer trembling, no longer locked in involuntary reflex. Just there, present, in the way only someone who had survived battle could be. Jude lit a small burner, boiled a bit of water for coffee. When he turned, Echo was standing at the entrance of the bunker, eyes fixed on something outside. But it wasn't the wary tension from the night before. It was steadier now, more grounded. He wasn't watching like prey, he was watching like someone who had decided where to stand. Jude came and sat beside him, resting a hand gently on Echo's back. I wouldn't blame you if you left, he murmured, if you were tired of running, of remembering, of resisting. Echo didn't move. Jude continued. Maybe you should disappear. Go where they can't trace you. You have that right. You don't owe anyone anything. There was a long silence. And then Echo did something simple. He sat down. Didn't look away. Didn't scan the horizon. His gaze stayed fixed on Jude. Unbroken. Unwavering. Not out of dependence, but out of conviction. Jude understood. No words were needed. No leash. No commands. Just one answer, delivered through a pair of steady eyes, and received by a man who never thought he'd bond with anyone again. All right, Jude said with a faint smile. Then we move forward. Together. And that morning, as they stepped out from the old shelter, crossing the brittle forest floor and heading north toward the ridge, where Jude had once set up an emergency comms station years ago, Echo no longer walked behind. He walked beside him, not to guard, not to scout, but to accompany. The northern ridge wasn't high, but it was treacherous. The narrow trails were hidden beneath layers of moss and overgrowth, making each step a quiet negotiation with the rocks underneath. Jude didn't speak much along the way. He didn't need to. Echo moved beside him as if he had walked this rhythm long before, as if this quiet, steady pace was already etched into his body. Dusk fell quicker beneath the dense pine canopy. By the time the last rays of light faded behind the mountains, they had arrived. A small wooden hut, half collapsed, hidden deep in the forest and wrapped in a wall of ivy-covered stone. It was once an emergency evacuation post built by Jude and a few old colleagues, back when he still believed the system could be repaired from the inside. He unlocked the rusted padlock and pulled open the heavy wooden door. A wave of musty air met the cold. Inside, it was dry, windless, and still safe enough to spend the night. They didn't turn on any lights. Jude lit a small fire using dry wood he had stashed long ago in a metal drum. Echo lay a few steps away, eyes open. The silence inside the hut grew dense, every breath suddenly a sound. Jude reached for his notebook, meaning to jot down a few lines, but he stopped, because Echo began to stir. It started with a sharp exhale, like he was gasping. Then his legs twitched, his head rubbed against the floor, ears folded back, his whole body locked into a rigid tension, as though reacting to a pain that had no name. Jude moved closer. He didn't touch. He just watched. Echo was dreaming, not an ordinary dream. This was the kind that makes muscle memory fire. His eyes moved beneath closed lids. His muzzle twitched. His paws scraped against the wooden floor as if running or being dragged. A low whimper escaped his throat, strangled, unclear, like a warning strangled mid-sentence. Jude whispered, "Echo, you're here. This is real. This is safe." Echo didn't wake, but his breathing began to slow. His legs settled. His eyes stopped flickering, and under the flicker of firelight he relaxed like someone who had just crossed through a storm of panic without medication, without commands, with nothing but the quiet presence of someone who believed he was no longer just a tool. Jude sat beside him, leaned against the wooden wall. His fingers brushed the thick fur, not to soothe Echo, but because he himself needed the contact. A thread, no matter how thin, was still a connection. Outside, the wind swept through the trees, but inside the hut, among firelight, breath, and the silent hum of emotion, an old dream was starting to transform. The forest night was never fully dark. A pale moon, muted behind drifting clouds, still managed to slip through a gap in the roof, casting silver threads through the cracks in the rotting wood above. The beams of light danced along the floor like fragments of fractured memory, mapping the ceiling like a broken constellation. The air carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, seeping in through the seams of the cabin. It smelled like a place that had hidden secrets, and was now slowly bleeding them out. Echo didn't sleep deeply. Jude could tell from the way his breathing fluctuated, steady at times, as if in recovery, then suddenly shallow and sharp, like something inside him was trying to surface. And then it happened. A whimper, not stifled like before, but clearer, not quite a cry, but undeniably pain. It was as if Echo's throat was trying to speak something that had been coded out of his mind. His tail jerked. His front legs scraped the floorboards in a repetitive motion, erratic and uncontrolled. His ears shot up, then flattened again. His eyes cracked open halfway, darting in unfocused terror. Jude dropped to his knees beside him. "Echo, listen to me. You're not there, not anymore." But Echo didn't hear him. His entire body locked, teeth clenched, his jaw pulled into a grimace, reacting to a phantom order. Then, without warning, he let out a short, sharp howl. It wasn't loud, it didn't echo, but the sound carried a precision that made Jude's blood run cold. It was a reflex tone, a command noise, the kind that once triggered a program. A second later, Echo bolted upright. He didn't attack. He didn't flee. He just stood there, panting, eyes clouded, one paw lifted in a combat-ready stance. But there was no enemy, no signal, just wind. And Jude. Jude didn't move, didn't speak, didn't soothe. He watched. Echo's eyes flicked, searching. Then, slowly, they found clarity. His jaw relaxed, ears lowered, shoulders softened. He remembered where he was. Jude approached, placed a hand on his neck. Echo didn't recoil, didn't bow, just stayed still. "You remembered something, didn't you?" Jude murmured. A shard, a sliver, but it was real. Echo didn't answer, but his eyes blinked, slow, deliberate, a nod without words. Jude sat down beside him, pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He didn't open it, didn't write. He just held it. A reminder to himself. Some things are recorded not with ink, but with presence. And as the firelight dimmed, as the forest wind mingled with Echo's now steady breath, Jude knew. The memories were returning. Not all at once, not completely. but each whimper, each tremor was another door nudging open. At first light, the sun filtered through the tree canopy, casting a trembling mosaic of gold across the worn wooden floor. Jude stirred, the stiffness in his back from sleeping against the wall still lingering. When he opened his eyes, Echo was already up, standing near the door, head turned back, watching him. There was something different about the way he stood today. It wasn't alertness, it wasn't readiness for combat, it was awareness from within. After a simple breakfast of warm water and a few slices of cured meat, Jude decided to check the old injury beneath Echo's neck. The seizures last night had left him unsettled. He needed to know if anything had changed. "Echo, come here." Echo walked over without hesitation. When Jude slipped his fingers beneath the thick fur at the nape of his neck, the dog didn't pull away, but his whole body tensed. And Jude understood. The reaction wasn't pain, it was memory. His fingers brushed a rough patch beneath the skin, scar tissue from the earlier removal. Jude tilted his head, turned on his inspection light. Everything seemed healed. But as the beam hit a certain angle, he caught it. A faint, metallic glint. Not leftover debris. A new device. Tiny, almost invisible. Jude reached for his toolkit, moved methodically. Echo lay down without being told, eyes wide open, calm, as if he knew it was in there, as if he had been waiting for it to be gone. When Jude gently removed it with tweezers, it clicked softly, too faint to hear. Instantly, the signal scanner beside him lit up, briefly registering a micro-pulse, just enough to trigger a chain of neural reflexes. Echo flinched, his pupils flared. For a second, his whole body locked. But Jude had already activated the signal jammer. The pulse stopped. Echo's eyes flickered, then settled. Jude exhaled, sharp and slow. He placed the device into an anti-static case and sealed it tight. Etched on its surface in fine letters was a code, Aurora N2, a designation from a long-defunct research arm. "Someone's still trying to activate you," Jude said quietly. Echo glanced at the case, then looked back at Jude. He didn't need to speak. His eyes said it all. He knew, and he had made his choice. To continue. Not for anyone else, for himself. Jude placed a hand on Echo's forehead, closed his eyes. "We'll peel it back, layer by layer. You don't belong to anyone anymore. From now on, you're just you." And when Echo gave the smallest nod, in the soft silence of the forest morning, Jude understood. One more thread of control had been cut, and a piece of freedom had returned. He stayed where he was, still holding the dog's neck, not to restrain him, but to remind him, "You're not alone. Someone still sees you. Not as an erased code, but as something whole." Echo breathed slow. His gaze was steady now, no longer darting. It stayed fixed on Jude, not with fear or hope or need, but with recognition, as if all the fragments breaking loose in the night had reassembled, not perfectly, but in a shape that finally felt real. Jude removed his gloves. Let his bare hand touch the soft fur around the scar. It was no longer a medical task. It was an act of returning something lost. He placed his palm gently on Echo's forehead and whispered, "You're still here, Echo. And no one gets to switch you on again." Echo didn't flinch, just lowered his ears slightly, not in submission, but in a deep, cellular calm. A surrender not to orders, but to trust. The morning wind stirred through the cracks in the cabin, lifting a blanket on the floor. Pale light passed over Echo's eyes, and Jude saw it. The color had changed. No longer that dark, dense shadow he first saw. Softer now, as if beneath the layers of signal storms, command loops, and nightmares, there remained something unbroken. A living being, finally learning how to just be. They sat there in silence for a long time. Man and dog, two fragments once rejected by the system, now quietly reassembled by presence alone. And at last, Echo leaned forward and rested his head on Jude's knee. A slow, natural gesture, like a creature that had waited a lifetime for a place to lean without watching its back. Jude didn't cry, but his throat clenched tight. Because in that one small moment he realized, just like Echo, he too had finally been released from something invisible the world once called duty. The third day in the forest. Afternoon arrived with a strange wind, not colder but different. There was something in the air that had shifted. Jude felt it in the way Echo rose earlier than usual, head lifted, ears erect but unmoving, as if he had been waiting for this. They broke camp early, descending a rocky slope that led to the edge of a dry riverbed. The forest canopy thinned out. Jude scanned for signal, checked the satellite phone. No more interference, but also no data at all. A strange void. A silence too perfect. And then, from across the slope, they appeared. 4 figures, black uniforms, unmarked. Their steps in unison. Each wore a communication earpiece and tactical gloves. But the last one, the one in the center, walking half a beat behind, wore no uniform. He was clad in a faded khaki jacket, unarmed, military-grade sunglasses masking his eyes. His face sent a chill down Jude's spine. Echo stopped. He didn't bark, didn't growl. But his body stiffened, tail lowered, eyes wide. Then slowly, he stepped back. Jude glanced at Echo, then at the man approaching. "I'm guessing you're the one who taught him his first low crawl?" Jude said, hand still resting on his pack. The man stopped, took off his sunglasses. His eyes were deep. Still, but not with remorse. It was the stillness of someone who had once believed there was nothing to be sorry for. "His name was E3, the man said. "I'm not here to take him back. I came to retrieve what should not have existed." Echo didn't move, but something shifted in his gaze. No longer confusion, recognition, and refusal. Jude set his pack on the ground, placed himself in front of Echo. "You don't get to make that call anymore." The wind picked up between them. The 4 others widened their formation. And behind Jude, Echo stepped forward, not to retreat, but to stand beside him. The standoff had begun. The man in the khaki jacket took another step. No signal needed. One of the 4 pulled a small, nearly invisible device from his pocket and pressed a button. No sound. No flash. Only... Echo trembled. Muscles along his spine spasmed, eyes widened, ears twitched violently. A silent screech clawed up his throat, and he folded, forelegs buckling, breathing ragged, claws scraping dirt. "Stop!" Jude shouted. No response. Echo raised his head, but his eyes had lost focus, as if being pulled from the present. An unspoken command, a code embedded too deeply, a reflex etched into his nervous system. Jude lunged, dropped beside him, hands on Echo's chest. "Echo, listen to me! Look at me!" Echo's eyes twitched. One hind leg began to tense. His throat made a strangled sound, half growl, half resistance. Jude didn't wait. He pulled a disruptor device from his jacket, flipped the neutralizer mode. A soft wave of signal pulsed out, not strong enough to erase, but enough to create a breach. Echo exhaled violently, eyes clenched, his body tilted. He collapsed. Not unconscious, but as if a noose had just snapped loose. Jude wrapped his arms around him, held tight. "I'm here. No one has the right to summon you back. Not anymore." 1 second, then another. Echo began to breathe again, fast, then slower. He opened his eyes, wet with tears, but clear, focused. And when he tried to rise, not out of reflex but of will, Jude knew. The fight wasn't over, but Echo had just won a round. Across from them, the man stood motionless, but his jaw tightened. "He doesn't respond like before," he said, half question, half confession, as if realizing he had lost something he once thought was his. The air, post-signal, froze. Echo still panted heavily by Jude's feet. Wind sliced through the open space, carrying the echoes of a time Jude had thought long gone. The man in the khaki jacket remained in place, didn't approach, didn't give another command. But his eyes grew stiller. Not angry, not afraid, just reassessing, as if recalculating an old design. Jude stood, didn't turn, didn't leave Echo's side. He stepped forward, placing himself fully between the dog and the one who had once programmed him. "I used to believe every system could be reformed," Jude said, voice low but steady. "That humans were the center of every correction. But you turned living beings into tools, and now you stand here waiting to see if your tool still functions." The man said nothing. "You can't call him anymore," Jude went on, "because he's chosen. Not you, not me, himself." Behind him, Echo rose slowly. No command. No cue. He stepped forward, unprompted, to stand beside Jude. Jude tilted his head, but didn't look at him. He knew. Echo was here, not because he was held back, but because he wanted to stay. The man gave a faint nod. "I didn't come to take him," he said. "I came to see if we had created something that could outgrow the blueprint." Jude clenched his fists. "And now you have your answer." Behind him, the four in uniform remained still. But the distance between them, between authority, technology, and a soul who had reclaimed its will, had never felt wider. Echo took one step, then another, unhurried, unafraid, not obedience, intention. Jude didn't stop him. He remained still, eyes watching. The man in the khaki jacket didn't retreat. He looked at Echo as if seeing a piece of memory materialize, only to realize it no longer belonged to him. Echo stopped a few steps away. Didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't show hostility. He simply looked him in the eye. A long, quiet gaze. No blame, no question, but no forgiveness either. A look that could only belong to those who were used, who survived, and who reclaimed their name. The man held his gaze. In that moment, the world fell silent. The wind paused. The birds went still. The four soldiers behind him did not move. "You remember me," he said quietly. Echo didn't respond, but his ear shifted slightly, a signal clear enough to say, "Yes." "And you choose not to return." This time Echo tilted his head ever so slightly. A slow nod. Not bound, not forced. A choice. The man exhaled and turned away, stepping back. He didn't apologize, but he gave no command either. Only silence remained. Echo turned and walked back to Jude. Unhurried, unshaken, as if he had just traveled to the farthest edge of his past and laid it down. And Jude, when he saw the light in Echo's eyes return, clear, full, unwavering, understood this. Echo wasn't just free. He had become his own soul. That afternoon, the forest seemed to soften. The wind no longer howled through the treetops. The cold no longer clung to the rustling leaves. Only a pale, golden light filtered through the pines, casting a quiet carpet beneath Jude and Echo's steps, as if guiding them toward a new beginning. They stopped at a flat clearing where a fallen tree lay nearly decomposed, its bark peeled away, its hollow core echoing softly. Jude sat down, took off his pack, and searched for something he had kept for a long time. A black collar with the inscription E3, its markings worn thin with time. Echo stood before him, unmoving. His eyes never left Jude. Jude held up the collar. Sunlight glinted off the cold metal surface. He spoke, not loudly but with clarity. "This no longer belongs to you, it never should have." He removed it from Echo's neck with both hands, slowly, as if lifting a curse. When the clasp unlatched with a faint click, Jude let it fall to the ground, into the afternoon light, where it was no longer an order, no longer a code, just a relic of what had once been imposed. Echo didn't move, but something in his eyes shifted, like the last layer of dust had finally been wiped clean from memory. Jude pulled out a soft leather band, hand-punched and stitched with wax thread. No serial number. No insignia. Just one hand-carved word. Ranger. This is your real name. Not because of orders, not because of duty, but because you survived, you stood up, and you chose. He fastened it gently around Echo's neck. Echo leaned toward him, not waiting for a command, not reacting by habit. He pressed his forehead into Jude's palm. Jude smiled softly. "Welcome home, Ranger." And that evening, in the quiet woods where no military boots echoed, where no frequency hummed, where no code names remained, there stood a soul with a true name, beginning again from within. When Jude spoke that name, Ranger, the world seemed to pause, not from the volume of the call, but from the weight of its meaning, striking a part of Echo that had never been awakened before. Echo, now Ranger, tilted his head slightly, as if hearing a strange sound, but there was no confusion in his gaze, only a brief stillness. Then he closed his eyes. One breath, two, and when they opened again, they were brighter. Jude said nothing more. He simply sat there, letting the wind move over his shoulders, the sunlight stretch across the rotting wood, and allowed Ranger to choose his first response to a name he'd never been given before. And Ranger did something no one had taught him, not a reflex, not a command. He turned, slowly, circling Jude once, then stopped and sat across from him. Back straight, eyes forward, ears up, not waiting for a signal, not seeking approval. Then, he raised his head, reached his muzzle out, and lightly touched Jude's chest, right where the old cloth hid the USB drive containing the full Odin records. A small gesture, but as clear as words. I know this was once part of me, but now I choose to carry it, as memory, not destiny. Jude's throat tightened. He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because standing before him was no longer a tool with a label, but a living declaration. A dog once called an instrument had found his name, and more than that, had chosen how to answer to it. The next morning dawned with a clarity that made it feel like the whole forest was exhaling after a long storm. Sunlight filtered through each branch, spreading warm gold over the ground, the wood, the shoulders of Jude beneath his pack, and the coat of Ranger, now full, glossy, and strong again. No more frequency pulses, no more commands hidden in sound, no more SUVs lurking at the forest's edge. Only a path winding toward the horizon, and two beings, one man, one dog, leaving the past not by escape, but with steps born of freedom. Jude looked at Ranger. "We won't go back to the cabin, not back to that hill. Everything old, we leave it. Keep it in memory, not carry it on our backs." Ranger walked beside him. No leash needed, no fear of noise. Every step was a steady rhythm, like someone who had walked out of the last base and chosen to go on for what he believed was right. They had no set destination, but Jude knew where he needed to go, an old safe station near the southern lakes, where old connection codes still linked him to people like Morgan, where he could open the USB without being tracked. But more than that, it was where he wanted Ranger to see the world, not as maps, missions, or limits, but as sky, fields, people, and creatures that lived not to fight. They crossed a shallow stream. Ranger drank, lifted his head, and ran a soft circle around Jude, not out of duty, but as if to say, "I can run. I want to run, and now I'm allowed to." Jude laughed. For the first time, he wasn't guarding memories. He was living. And Ranger, no longer E3, no longer a reflex, no longer a number, walked beside him as the simplest thing of all, a friend. Not all wounds leave scars on skin. Some cuts lie deep in memory, beneath commands, codes, and names that never belonged. Echo, now Ranger, did not win with teeth or growls. He won in the silence of a soul once controlled, now rising on its own legs. We can't erase the past, but we can choose how we move forward without letting it define who we are. This story isn't just about a dog. It is a reminder. No matter where you came from, what they once called you, or how they used you, you can still begin again, with a name of your own choosing. Because sometimes the bravest thing is not running away. It's deciding to live. For real.